This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology. Chapter 10, Trophic Dynamics. Trophic dynamics is a technical term for what most people call eating. Trophic dynamics govern the movement of carbon, nutrients, and energy among organisms in an ecosystem. Although terrestrial animals consume a relatively small proportion of net primary production, they strongly influence energy flow and nutrient cycling in most ecosystems. Trophic dynamics involves consumption. There are many ways that energy and material are transferred among organisms, but when we think about trophic dynamics, we're primarily thinking about consumption, the eating of one organism or part of the organism by another. Some of the boundaries of what represents trophic dynamics and other factors we're not going to cover really in detail, but we're just going to try and get through the basics of the consequences of animals eating other organisms. Now, sometimes trophic dynamics are pretty mundane. There's not much exciting about a cow eating grass. But in other cases, trophic dynamics can be very exciting. Thinking about lions consuming their prey. These are all trophic dynamics, and each of these has similarities in that it represents the transfer of energy and materials from one set of organisms to another. Approximately 95% of energy transfers in most terrestrial ecosystems are associated with plants and microbes, and only a small proportion are actually things eating plants. So therefore, when terrestrial ecologists, or at least terrestrial ecosystem ecologists, have thought about terrestrial systems, they've mostly ignored some of the trophic dynamics that happen there. As far as the amount of energy and materials being transferred from plants to animals and among animals, it's a relatively small proportion of the budget. On the other hand, it's relatively hard to ignore trophic dynamics in aquatic systems. If you go to a particular aquatic system, in general, a large proportion of the net primary productivity is going to be consumed by herbivorous animals. And so in that case, it's been aquatic systems that have really led the way in thinking about trophic dynamics. Now, there are differences between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems in those trophic dynamics, more than just the amount that's consumed, but a lot of the theory that we have in ecosystem ecology for trophic dynamics comes out of the aquatic literature. This here is figure 10.1, and it's a summary that shows the degree of herbivory that we have along a productivity gradient. So here on the x-axis is net primary production, grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And then on the y-axis we have herbivory, grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Each one of these dots represents a different ecosystems. And what we can do is we can compare the rates of primary production in herbivory between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So if we take a look at this line here, this represents terrestrial ecosystems, and the one above it, aquatic ecosystems. At a given level of primary production, you can see that a smaller fraction of primary production is consumed by herbivores. This is also a log scale, which means a small amount of difference can actually mean a relatively large proportional difference between the two systems. So in that sense, if we just compared aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, we're going to see that it's really the aquatic ecosystems that have a larger proportion of their production consumed by herbivores. Trophic dynamics have direct and indirect effects on energy and material transfers. So it's easy to think about the direct effects. If you have a system and energy and materials have been taken up by plants, for example, and then you take a look at herbivores here, that thinking about trophic dynamics is important because there's going to be transfers of energy and material from here to here. But there are also indirect effects too, and we have to think about those indirect effects as much as their direct effects. What we learn in doing this is that even where small, herbivores are important. So across a wide variety of ecosystems, whether the proportion of net primary production that herbivores consume is large or small, they're still important components in the system, and we need to incorporate them in our understanding. The authors offer a focal issue for thinking more about trophic dynamics and why they're important. Intense herbivory, due to either overstocking of domestic animals or to removal of predators from less intensively managed systems, reduces the density and diversity of palatable plants. So what they're saying here in this statement is that when we have intense herbivory, there's going to be selection for palatable plants, and they're going to decline in both density and diversity. And this is something that can happen when domestic grazers, for example, are stocked at a relatively high rate, or when we remove predators, it allows the release of native herbivores. And that can have big impacts also in systems that are not intensively managed. So example that they show here is for Australian rangelands. And essentially, Australian rangelands these days are stocked in large part by cattle. There can be relatively low productivity, but the cattle can go through and really degrade the system as far as taking out the palatable grasses and allowing release of the shrubs. So the questions that we have to face as ecosystem ecologists when we're trying to understand herbivory is ask, why do herbivores eat more of some plant species than others? So they're going to prefer some species, but what is it about those plants that herbivores are going to use to prefer them? We know, for example, from looking at plants that for all intents and purposes, the energy content of the different species, a leaf of different species, is more or less going to be the same. So why are some plant species preferred over others? Secondly, how do interactions between plants, herbivores, and their predators influence the structure and functioning of ecosystems? So if we go to a system where you take a look at the net primary productivity, and only a small proportion of that primary productivity is transferred over to herbivores, what is it about their effects on that small proportion of the productivity, even though the majority of the productivity is not consumed, that really changes the structure and the function of those ecosystems? What do herbivores do in their consumption of plants that leads to a restructuring of the ecosystem?